Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. Before we really begin, I'm going to apologize in advance for the 2 Ds of interruption, ducks and dogs here in my backyard. But it's a lovely day and I wanted to film outside, and the hiking trails around my house are questionable at best at the minute because of certain tensions in my neighborhood. And I don't want to have to interact with pissed off neighbors, so please, ducks and dogs, they live here. This is their world. I just exist to be bossed around by them. So right now, today, what we're going to talk about is a little bit more to the wolf conservation story. And if you watch one of my more recent Sunday videos, you'll have seen me already touch on the topic a little bit. But now we're going to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at the proposition that just passed in Colorado. Before we get into it, keep in mind that I'm from Southern California, so most of my interest about this particular proposition was piqued after I saw the news that it was passed. So I am a little bit removed just in that I'm not from Colorado, I'm from California. All right, so since I am a latte drinking snowflake, according to certain people with opposing views, I have grabbed my coffee. It's not a latte today because I do not have the ability to make a proper latte at home. And let's begin to discuss what exactly Colorado Proposition 114 or 114, not entirely sure the proper way to say a proposition with 3 numbers in the title is. So what this proposition does is it requires Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission to create and carry out a plan to reintroduce gray wolves to the Colorado lands west of the Continental Divide. This will effectively connect gray wolf populations that are in the Rockies. As it stands right now, the gray wolf populations that do exist in the northern and southern parts of the Rockies are very unlikely to be able to connect because of just these distances between them and also the loss of their federal protection back in October. With the loss of their federal protection, it means that states are open to begin hunting them pretty much indiscriminately, like Wisconsin, I believe. You can check me there. I have that linked in my other video about wolf conservation, which I will link down in the description below here. And in these states that have very high populations of ranchers and things like that, there is a lot of villainization that goes on towards the wolves and other predatory species. So this proposition will effectively reintroduce wolves into that kind of middle ground where they've been missing, so that these isolated populations can then connect and the Rockies can then have eventually stable wolf populations once again throughout. And wolves are a keystone species, so it will only cascade through the trophic levels and promote healthier ecosystems in the long run. So once again, they have until the end of 2023 to create and carry out this plan. Let's take a little bit of a look at those who have been publicly supporting the Proposition 114 and those who have been publicly opposed to Proposition 114, because I think that that information is interesting and relevant. So what I'm about to say to you can be double checked at my Ballotpedia source down in the description below, which did kind of break the proposition down and break the supporting and where the funding was coming from down a little bit. So the support was led by the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund. So they were kind of in charge of the campaign in favor of reintroducing wolves to this part of the Rockies. And one thing that I would like to note here is that if we think back to my video that I will link down below about the whole federal delisting of wolves as an endangered species in the contiguous United States, the support for that was largely Republican. Well, if we look at the support for reintroducing wolves into the Rockies in this particular area, we'll notice that the former officials that are listed as publicly supporting this measure are Democratic in their leaning, specifically former Colorado Governor Bill Ritter and former U.S. Senator Mark Udall, not 100% sure how to pronounce that name. But we also have the former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lead on the Mexican Wolf Recovery Program, Dave Parsons, and the former Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission Chair, Jim Pribley, publicly supporting this measure. And then, of course, we have a few organizations like the Global Indigenous Council, Progress Now Colorado, Public Employees of Environmental Responsibility, and the Sierra Club Colorado, as well as Tim Ferriss, an author, podcaster, entrepreneur. So this is who they have publicly in support of this measure. So the list isn't very long of these public officials in support. So if we scroll down and look at the opposition, which is largely a more conservative Republican backing, in that one of the former officials that opposes this measure is Rick Enstrom, a Republican. I'm not sure what office he held. It's not listed here, and I didn't go look that up because I did not want to. But the opposition was led by the Coloradans Protecting Wildlife, or Rethink Wolves, and Coloradans Defending Our Wildlife organizations, which we will get into them in just a minute. But I think that their names are a little ironic, and I will explain why in a second when we talk about them a little more. It's also important to note that there is one currently sitting official that is in public opposition to this proposition. And this state representative is not from Colorado, which I found interesting. This is a Utah state representative, Logan Wild, who is technically nonpartisan, but I just found it interesting that a state representative from Utah is taking so much interest in this bill that affects Colorado. And last time I checked, Utah is not Colorado. But I mean, I guess I could be wrong there, since I am just some liberal tree-hugging snowflake from California. So it's also important to note that the Republican Party of Colorado is among those listed in opposition to the proposition that would require the reintroduction of wolves into Colorado. And of course, there's a list of organizations and individual, and the list of organizations are a lot of farming and agriculture associations, and it looks like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and we will get into that in just a second. So I think it's important to keep in mind here that despite the plethora of opposition for this proposition, at least on paper, the measure did pass. So in this last election cycle, Proposition 114 was on the Colorado ballot, and it did pass. So as of right now, if this measure stays in place, then by the end of 2023, there should be a reintroduction of wolves into those Colorado Rockies. But let's talk a little bit about that Wolf Action Fund versus the Coloradans Protecting Wildlife, or Rethink Wolves. I'm going to go ahead and note here that I was unable to find a website for Coloradans defending our wildlife, and every time I Googled them, it just led me back to the other organization, so take that as you will. So Wolf Action Fund. Remember, Wolf Action Fund is the organization that is in support, that has been kind of leading the campaign in favor of Proposition 114. So if you go onto their website, it will link you back pretty quickly to the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, which I do highly suggest you check out that website. It very clearly lays out the argument based on their recent ecological consensuses. It goes back to discuss what wolves did in Yellowstone in rebalancing out those ecosystems. And it is backed by organizations like Defenders of Wildlife and other conservation groups that are known to rely on current science and current ecological studies and research. So their argument is laid out and linked back entirely to science, entirely what we know about ecology and what we know about keystone species like wolves. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about Coloradans protecting wildlife, or Rethink Wolves. So if you look at their website, which I have linked down below for transparency's sake, the first thing that you're going to notice is a bunch of arguments that are going to slap you in the face with fear-mongering. So they have a lot of kind of general claims like wolves will attack hikers and wolves are these indiscriminate killing machines. I'm paraphrasing a little bit there because the words that they used are not that big. But the point is that their arguments are made with fear-mongering. Their points are backed up with fear-mongering and urban legend and myth. Their statements are not backed by science, and from what I could find, nothing that they say can link back to any organization that does rely on science that could then link back to studies and actual real ecology data. They also are perpetuating the myth that wolves are these indiscriminate killing machines that are going to attack hikers and livestock. And they kind of make that point several times in several different areas. So it's pretty obvious what they're kind of going for with their whole spiel. And basically their argument boils down to it's going to hurt agriculture because wolves are just going to kill livestock. It's going to hurt the hunting industry because wolves are going to decimate the elk and deer populations. And it's going to ultimately hurt our tourism because wolves are going to destroy our ecosystems. So we're going to talk about those points in just a second. The point with those points is that they are easily refutable if you look at the science. But before we really get into that, it is also being noted by some who are in favor of the proposition and in favor of reintroducing wolves that the federal delisting of gray wolves is a good thing for this particular scenario. And the argument there is that the Colorado officials won't have to get federal fish and game permissions, and the federal level won't have to be involved. However, I would like to point out that this measure was already introduced prior to the federal delisting on October 29th of 2020, which implies that federal supports and permissions would have been feasible. So I don't necessarily think that for this to happen, gray wolves would have to be federally delisted, especially since in this proposition, the money for this program would come from the state level, not from the federal level anyway. So the most they would have needed would be to get federal sign-offs on their plans. But a quick note here is that the federal decision to remove the gray wolves from the list of endangered and threatened species is currently going to be challenged in courts, and there are already conservation organizations working on that right now. And so speaking of courts, the passing of this Colorado Proposition 114 is likely to be challenged in courts, especially by that coalition of the agricultural associations and hunting associations. And why we put a pin in those arguments that I mentioned a second ago is because we're going to dissect them here, because the claims that they're going to use are these fear-mongering arguments on that website in opposition to the reintroduction of wolves. So let's take this kind of one claim at a time. So the claim that wolves are going to decimate game populations. That is not backed by science. Wolves promote healthy ecosystems and the natural control of elk and deer populations. The way that things like this work with these predator-prey cycles is generally, like I mentioned before in my previous video, you're going to get kind of an oscillation up and down around a kind of arbitrary number there of the prey population. So you'll have these booms and you'll have these crashes. Well, right along with it and just behind it, you'll have the predator population doing the same thing. And that's just how it works. You'll have these booms, you'll have these crashes, and they're going to be intertwined and based on each other. Having that pressure from the predator will keep these prey species moving. It'll weed out the sick and injured individuals from the herd, and it will keep them from overfeeding in one area. Like in the Yellowstone example specifically, you had elk decimating these very young willow stands. Well, wolves were introduced, the willows were able to grow properly because the elk were moving properly. So that is likely what is going to happen if this measure stays in place, if it doesn't lose in court. Wolves will only help promote the healthy ecosystems in Colorado and help these game populations be a little bit more controlled and keep them in these kind of natural migratory cycles without overgrazing in any one area, which overall is just bad for the ecosystem. So also, it's important to note that areas with wolf reintroduction show no damage to their hunting industry. So one of the arguments is that, oh, it's going to kill all the elk and then hunters won't be able to hunt as much. That argument is nonsensical, and that's really all I have to say on that one. Sure, you might not have as many tags, but there's really no data to support that even. Again, there's no real damage to the hunting industry. You just might have to move a little more to find the elk. So let's move on to the claim that wolves will impact livestock and the livelihood of ranchers. So if you look at my previous wolf video, you will see that there is very recent evidence that wolves actually prefer wild livestock to prey, wild prey to domesticated livestock. So even when there was an abundance of livestock and kind of less prey, the diet of wolves was primarily wild prey, not the domesticated livestock. And that study is linked in my previous video that is linked in this description. And it is a public access, and I do highly recommend you go check that study out because it is very interesting. And there are also these non-lethal options that can be explored to protect livestock from predators like wolves. Again, in my last video, I mentioned what they do in South Africa for the cheetahs. They raise these large dogs with flocks that then help protect them from wild predators. And then it also protects the cheetahs because they're not getting killed because livestock that the cheetahs didn't actually kill, but that's an entirely different video. They're not getting killed as the result of pissed off ranchers. There's a clause in this proposition to financially compensate ranchers for any animals lost to wolf predation. So the whole it will destroy the livelihood of ranchers is ridiculous not just for the reasons that I stated that wolves prefer live or wild prey, but also because if they do lose something to wolf predation, there are steps they can take to be compensated. And the claim that wolves are going to attack hikers and destroy the tourism and destroy the ecosystem is, I don't know if I even really want to address it for realsies, because it's ridiculous. Wolves are very shy in nature, and they're not going to go out of their way to attack hikers. I don't really know what to tell you. If you follow the rule of stay at least 100 yards away from predators when you see them in the wild, you're going to be good, boo. Like, wolves are definitely more scared of you than you are of them, and they're not going to destroy the environment. They're going to help the environment. And if you have healthier ecosystems, you know, your tourism industry might even get a little bit of a boost. So perhaps you should research the things that you try to claim before you claim them. That's all I really have to say for that point. But there's one more claim that they don't really explain, is that any positive impact of wolves will only be temporary. So they do concede the point that the introduction of wolves will have a positive trophic cascade, so the ecosystem will be healthier, but they claim that that's just temporary. That's just not backed by science. When you reintroduce a keystone species to an ecosystem, it can only help it become more healthy, and reintroducing wolves won't just have these temporary positive effects. They will be long-term, and that's another claim that I really don't think we need to go much farther into. So the bottom line here is that the reintroduction of wolves will bring back healthy ecosystems. The populations will be reconnected in the Rockies, and there's still a legal battle, and wolves in the lower 48 United States still need protection. Their populations are still not stable, and they need a little bit of help from us. So I very much support this reintroduction measure, and I definitely hope that it's able to stand once it goes through the legal battles that are ahead of it. So that's all I really have for you guys today. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving in the United States, and I do hope that you all have a pleasant Thanksgiving. Please stay safe and keep in mind that there is still a virus out there. So make good choices, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.